1944. World War II was reaching its dramatic climax.
Rocket ships firing, aircraft flying overhead.
As the Allies waged total war to liberate occupied Europe.
This was a war in which all sides were learning as they went.
From the beaches of Normandy,
the water was full of blood. The water was bright red.
To the forests of Germany.
Ich sehe dort heute noch die ganzen Toten liegen.
Both sides deployed weapons of ever greater power and sophistication.
And this tank suddenly gives the American a real big advantage. It's a very effective beast.
This is the story of the Western Allies' final campaign, told by the men on both sides who were there.
You did what you did. You fire and you maneuver.
He was my brother.
In September 1944, along the Dutch-Belgian border, the Allies began a desperate battle to clear well-entrenched German troops from a key strategic waterway.
The Germans had been there for 4 years. They knew the areas all there like the back of their hand. And regardless of what you hear, they were very formidable.
Possession of the Scheldt Estuary was vital for the Allied advance into Germany. But German forces held both shores and would use every advantage offered by treacherous terrain.
Every time you made an advance, the Germans would blow the dikes and flood the land.
It was strewn with mines. Everywhere there was minefield.
The month-long, grueling campaign for this estuary would be Canada's bloodiest battle of World War II. This is the story of the Battle of the Scheldt. By September 1944, Hitler's Germany was staring defeat in the face. That summer, Stalin's Red Army had smashed through German forces on the Eastern Front and advanced as far as Poland and Romania. In the west, the Allies had liberated France and were closing in on the River Rhine and the German frontier. But then an Allied supply crisis brought the advance to a grinding halt.
The Allied industries back home in the United States and Britain were producing enormous amounts of supplies. Tens of thousands of tanks, millions of rounds of ammunition, and millions of gallons of fuel. The challenge was getting all of those supplies to their frontline troops.
The Allies had 5 armies in the field, 2.5 million men advancing on a broad front towards the Rhine. But their supplies still came from their Normandy beachhead, 300 miles to the rear. Frontline troops were no longer getting the fuel and ammunition they needed to continue the advance.
Modern warfare needs lots of petrol. Tanks gobble up petrol more than our cars do.
This is where there was this great argument about how the Allied forces should make their next move because they were running out of supplies.
Then, on the 4th of September, the British 11th Armoured Division captured the Belgian port of Antwerp. Crucially, with the help of the Belgian resistance, the British were able to capture the port intact before the Germans could sabotage it. At first glance, it seemed as if all the Allied supply issues would soon be at an end.
There are miles and miles and miles of docks there. Antwerp is the biggest, or was then the biggest harbour really in Europe. It was the biggest plum for the British Army.
We had Antwerp, and the harbour was intact. Still cranes and everything could be used. And most of the other places, like the other ports we took, the Germans had blown up the cranes and stuff, couldn't use the ports properly.
But there was one major problem. Antwerp is connected to the sea by a 45-mile-long estuary of the River Scheldt, which was still heavily mined and defended by the Germans. The Allies couldn't land supplies in Antwerp until the Scheldt had been cleared.
Once the Scheldt Estuary was cleared, the Allies could turn that into their main supply port, which would be sufficient to supply pretty much their entire war effort for the remaining campaign as they drove into Germany. And of course, the Germans knew that as well.
The Germans had built heavy coastal gun batteries on Walcheren Island, dominating the West Scheldt Estuary and making it impossible for Allied ships to reach Antwerp. The guns along the estuary were protected by thick concrete bunkers, almost impervious to air attack. They could only be taken by ground assault, across a landscape of rivers and open mudflats, with approaches covered by artillery and anti-tank guns, and beaches strewn with barbed wire and minefields. This hugely challenging assignment was given to the 1st Canadian Army, a multinational force made up of 2 Canadian and 2 British infantry divisions, with 1 Canadian and 1 Polish armoured division. The army included many Normandy veterans, but their hard-won combat experience was now being diluted by the arrival of raw recruits to replace casualties.
Some of them had been in the army less than 6 months. They brought them overseas, crossed the channel onto the trucks and up to the front and dumped them off. As we were trying to whip everybody into shape, they didn't know how to load a rifle, they didn't know how to prime a grenade, they knew nothing about infantry work.
In command of the army was Lieutenant General Guy Simonds. Simonds was a born soldier who'd won the Sword of Honour at Canada's Royal Military College. An expert in the evolving art of mechanized warfare, his rise to senior command had been meteoric, leading a division in Sicily and a corps in Normandy. When his boss, Lieutenant General Crerar, commanding 1st Canadian Army, fell ill, Simonds was the obvious replacement, and at 41 became the Western Allies' youngest army commander by 7 years.
Very British Canadian, he had been born in Britain. His father had been an officer in the British Army. His grandfather had been an officer in the army of the East India Company. Very highly regarded by Montgomery, by Eisenhower and by Bradley, perhaps in contrast to the actual commander of 1st Canadian Army, General Sir Harry Crerar, a Canadian who was found to be a little difficult to work with. The other way of looking at that is that they regarded Simonds as a good officer because he thought much the same way that they did, that Montgomery found Simonds easier to cooperate with, and so did many others.
Simonds' job was made more difficult by fierce disagreements about Allied strategy that autumn. The Supreme Allied Commander, General Eisenhower, favoured an advance against Germany on a broad front. But British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery believed that a single thrust across the Rhine River would get the Allies to Berlin and end the war by Christmas. Such a move, if successful, would make German defences along the Scheldt irrelevant. So that September, Simonds' advance on the Scheldt was put on pause, while Montgomery launched his ambitious airborne operation, codenamed Market Garden. But Market Garden ended in disaster.
The paratroopers took the bridges and held them until we got there. We took over from the American paratroopers at Nijmegen, and the next one after that was Arnhem, and that's the one they couldn't get. And that's where our paratroopers dropped in and got slaughtered.
And of course they had Market Garden, the airborne, bridge too far. They had that, and that failed. So they said, well, we've got to get Antwerp open.
The failure of Operation Market Garden not only cost lives and resources. By delaying the Canadian attack on the Scheldt, the task had been made significantly harder. The Germans made good use of their 4 weeks' breathing space, moving thousands of reinforcements into position along the estuary. By the time Montgomery accepted that clearing the Scheldt Estuary must be the new priority, German defences were more formidable than ever. That October, the Western Allies were relying on 1st Canadian Army to get the job done. It was up to them to clear German defenders from the Scheldt Estuary, so that urgently needed supplies and reinforcements could make it through to the port of Antwerp. Until now, 1st Canadian Army's efforts had been overshadowed by events elsewhere, but no longer. The Canadian plan involved 4 phases. Phase 1. 2nd Canadian Infantry Division, supported by 4th Canadian Armoured, would push north from Antwerp to secure Woensdrecht and Bergen op Zoom at the neck of the South Beveland Peninsula. Phase 2, 3rd Canadian Infantry Division and 1st Polish Armoured would eliminate German forces along the south bank of the Scheldt. Phase 3, Canadian troops would advance up the narrow South Beveland Peninsula, before Simmons launched Phase 4, an attack on Walcheren Island by land and sea. One of the biggest challenges facing the troops would be the treacherous landscape. The terrain was wet and boggy, with open country crossed by dikes and waterways.
The land around the Scheldt was polder territory. This meant that it had been reclaimed from the sea. The land was divided up by dikes, and between them, it had been flooded by the Germans.
They had flooded the land and you're in water all the time. The only protection you get is if you try to get too high on the what do you call the dikes, then you're a target.
The dikes themselves were steep embankments, like ramparts, about 14 feet high, and made ideal defensive positions for the Germans. With hardly any usable roads for tanks, the struggle for the Scheldt would be overwhelmingly an infantry battle.
Why didn't the Air Force just go and flatten the place? Just flatten the place. You got all kinds of ammunition. No, send the infantry in there. It's terrible, terrible.
More than ever, Canadian soldiers would rely on the weapons and equipment they could haul forwards themselves over the flooded plains and steep embankments.
The Canadian Army in 1944 were equipped and armed almost identically to the British Army, and that went for their tactics and training too. Every platoon, most men were armed with the No. 4 Lee Enfield rifle. The section commanders were all armed with Sten submachine guns. But unlike the Germans, which was very, very beautifully made, high-precision engineering, these were cheap. The whole thing made for 15 shillings. There were only 2 pieces which were machined, the barrel and the breech block. The rest of it just made out of stamped steel, welded together. But actually, they weren't that reliable. The main infantry support weapon was the Bren light machine gun. The Bren was an incredibly accurate, beautifully designed weapon, completely reliable, and was quite capable of putting 2 bullets through the same hole with a well-trained gunner. These weapons and tactics, which had been honed in the fighting since Normandy, suddenly meant nothing in the fighting in the Scheldt because the land was flooded, there wasn't the opportunity for manoeuvre, and the troops were funneled through drainage ditches, through dikes, and across causeways, so they were having to advance on an incredibly narrow front. And on the other side, the Germans knew exactly where they would be coming from.
Those German defenders were being exhorted to ever greater levels of sacrifice by their Führer, who had implemented a new strategy, the Festung, or fortress city.
Hitler designated certain areas as fortress zones or fortress cities, and his goal was really to invigorate the defenders of those cities, to make them fight to the last man, to not surrender, to sell themselves as dearly as possible, and really to destroy the usefulness of those areas in the process. He did this with a number of port cities. He did this with the estuary outside of Antwerp. And the goal was really to slow the Allies down as much as possible.
But that summer, the German army had suffered disastrous losses in men and equipment, both in France and on the Eastern Front. It was now relying increasingly on teenagers and second-rate conscripts. the ragtag mix of divisions holding the Scheldt typified the Wehrmacht's diminished strength. 64th Division, defending the south bank of the Scheldt, was the strongest, with 11,000 men and a large number of heavy weapons. The 3 divisions of 67 Corps, holding the area north of Antwerp, were at half strength, and most were poorly trained. While 70th Division, holding Walcheren Island, was made up of men who, until recently, had been classed as medically unfit for service.
Previous fighting and the huge casualties had inflicted so many losses on the German army that they were simply not able to find enough recruits to refill their ranks. So what they did at that particular time is that they would go into hospitals, to military hospitals, and also draft people who up to that point had been medically unfit, and would draft them into specific units.
You see what are called stomach battalions of men who are otherwise fit but who need a special diet. Ear battalions of men who have ear damage or hearing damage and need special doctors, or foot battalions. All of these are simply being put back into the line, not as first-class infantry, but as men who can still fight.
On the 2nd of October, the Canadian 2nd Infantry Division opened the Battle of the Scheldt with an attack north from Antwerp. Their objective was to secure access to the South Beveland Peninsula, isolating German forces from the Dutch mainland. But they would need to fight their way through the villages of Hoogheide and Woensdrecht. At first, the Canadians made steady progress, overcoming sporadic German resistance and liberating several small villages on the Dutch-Belgian border. But as they neared their objective, they ran into a strong defensive network of roadblocks, anti-tank ditches, and assault guns. It was typical of the well-planned German defenses the Allies encountered throughout the battle.
The Germans had lots of time to prepare for us coming. I can remember they even had numbers on top of the roofs, 264 or something. And that was the infantry would see that number and call back for artillery fire. And they'd be able to very quickly be able to know exactly where that was. And so they used to shell us, but they had lots of time to prepare.
On the 7th of October, bitter fighting erupted around Hoogheide and Woensdrecht, with the Germans determined to keep control over the crucial access to South Beveland.
The town of Hoogheide, which overlooked Woensdrecht, and they had heavy artillery, mortars, at a very, very short distance. You could see the people operating the weapons on that hill.
The German 15th Army had clear orders from its commander. The people and Führer of Germany were watching, they were told. The Scheldt defenses must be held to the end. That commander was General Gustav Adolf von Sangen. An experienced officer who'd led a division on the Eastern Front, he'd been given command of 15th Army in the Calais region of France 6 weeks earlier. Despite heavy Allied attacks, he'd successfully withdrawn his units to Holland and established a formidable defensive line around the Scheldt.
He was a very driven commander, and he made clear to his troops that the fighting in the Scheldt Estuary was of the utmost importance for the future conduct of war and the future of Germany.
Contrary to the impression given by newsreel propaganda, by autumn 1944, German tanks were in short supply. The very few armoured units at von Sangen's disposal would instead rely on simpler, but highly effective, mobile assault guns.
At the beginning of World War II, the Germans have developed a vehicle called an assault gun, or Sturmgeschütz. And the idea is really you get a tank chassis, you put a support howitzer in it with a superstructure on the top, and that helps the infantry to attack prepared positions. After the invasion of Russia in June of 1941, Hitler makes a suggestion that the 7.5 centimetre anti-tank gun is added to the Sturmgeschütz chassis, and that changes the vehicle into a great tank-killing weapon. One of the issues with the Sturmgeschütz is low in profile because it doesn't have that turret, and that means it's an effective weapon to be able to hide, and it's also, because it's smaller, a harder weapon to hit. As the war progresses, the Germans are trying to thicken the armour, but they're losing some of their production facilities. So if you actually look on this example of a Sturmgeschütz, this extra armour that's been placed on the front is actually concrete, just to thicken the levels of protection for the crew inside. The problem, of course, is this cannot be turned on like a 360 turret. So it's great in the defensive role, but less good in the attack.
The assault guns that stalled the Canadian advance at Hoogerheide belonged to a German Kampfgruppe, or battle group.
The near-complete destruction of the larger organization of the German army in the West meant that there were a lot of units that were not with who they had started out with, were not organized, had suffered heavy casualties. And the Germans found that the best way to use them were simply to put them together into an informal group, a Kampfgruppe, and send them back out to fight together.
This particular Kampfgruppe is a very good example of it. Kampfgruppe, or battle group Scheldt, were named after their commanding officer, Generalleutnant Lieutenant General Scheldt. The Canadian intelligence report classed him as a very skillful and very driven military commander. They assembled a battle group, a Kampfgruppe of about 3,000 men, consisting of remnants of 3 infantry divisions, in particular the 85th Infantry Division, together with a number of paratroopers. And these 3,000 men became, as the Germans call them, the fire brigade of the Scheldt Estuary. They were one of the most powerful and experienced combat formations that the Germans had. And whenever there was heavy fighting, this particular unit would be sent.
Kampfgruppe Hill put up fierce resistance and launched fast-moving, hard-hitting counterattacks whenever possible. The Canadians suddenly found themselves in the hardest fighting they'd seen since Normandy. The intensity of combat threatened to overwhelm some units, and for one regiment would lead to complete disaster. The Canadian Black Watch had a reputation as an unlucky regiment. In Normandy, in one disastrous attack, its 2 senior officers had been killed, and the regiment cut to pieces. On Friday, the 13th of October, the same regiment was ordered to lead an attack on a railway embankment held by paratroopers of Kampfgruppe Hill. It would go down in Canadian military history as Black Friday.
They held the high ground on the right, and we were down on the flatlands with 2 or 3 polders as our protection. The Germans had the last polder. They had the very last polder. And as soon as you put your head up, there'd be a grenade come at you. And there was the railway tracks on the left with high ground there, which they also occupied. Our purpose was to advance past those polders, get to the railway station and cut off the enemy's movements on the road and the railway. We couldn't do it. We lost all those men. Black Friday the 13th.
The 4 attacking companies of the Black Watch lost 150 men killed, and the embankment remained in German hands.
One of the main problems that the Canadians are facing, which lead to these very high casualty rates, is the fact that communications are very poor. When C Company starts its attack, the preliminary artillery bombardment comes in too early, and so it comes in 30 minutes before the infantry actually starts its attack, which of course gives the Germans enough time to get back into their positions and prepare their weapons for the advancing Canadians.
The Canadians attacked again 3 days later. Finally, through tenacity and sheer weight of fire, they fought their way into what remained of the Dutch village of Woensdrecht. At high cost, the Canadians had cut off the South Beveland Peninsula and the 15,000 Germans defending it. Meanwhile, Simmons had launched the second phase of the battle on the southwest bank of the Scheldt, dubbed the Breskens Pocket. The Canadians' first obstacle was the Leopold Canal. General Simmons believed the attack to clear the Breskens Pocket, codenamed Operation Switchback, would take 4 days. It began on the 6th of October with an assault across the Leopold Canal. For some companies, the crossing was carried out in eerie silence.
We were under orders not to shoot unless we were attacked. And we suddenly realized the Germans must be under the same order too, because they see us, but they're not shooting anything either. So it was a kind of a silence on the canal.
A few Canadian companies got across the canal without coming under fire. But others were not so lucky and ran into fierce opposition, taking heavy losses. Allied intelligence, it later emerged, had seriously underestimated the strength of German forces in the Breskens Pocket. Slowly, the Canadians carved out a bridgehead on the far bank of the canal. Walter Balfour, a machine gunner with the 4th Canadian Armoured Division, spotted a German artillery observer guiding fire onto his unit.
So I opened up on them with the Bren gun. I had rolled down off the top of the dike because they opened up with a machine gun right away on trying to cut the top of the dike. But later on, the other troops farther up said they saw 2 German stretcher bearers come out very cautiously, wondering whether they might, whether they were going to be shot or what, they could get. And they didn't bother let them. They said they went up to where this brush pile was and loaded a guy on the stretcher and took him out. But that solved the problem for these guys who were on the bottom of at the canal bank, because he was creating a lot of havoc, a lot of rough times for them.
As the attack across the canal ran out of momentum, Simmons launched the Canadian Highland Brigade in a daring amphibious flanking attack on Hoofdplaat. The attack would be made with the help of an extraordinary new amphibious vehicle, originally designed for a somewhat sunnier climate.
This vehicle's what's called a buffalo, and it was developed from a design to pick up people in the Florida Everglades. The idea being that it can float, but it's also got tracks. The tracks were developed in a way that they've got these scoops on, so as they turn, they can propel a vehicle through water. Now, the American military liked the idea, and the British and Canadian forces use them as well. So to clear the Scheldt Estuary and the island of Walcheren at the end of it, a number of operations took place. And that's when the Buffalo, with its amphibious capability, its ability to take men across boggy ground, crossing rivers, dikes, even the open sea, it came into its own.
But the Canadians had had almost no time to train with the new amphibious vehicles, forcing the operation to be postponed by 24 hours. When the attack went ahead, it was a complete success. Canadian infantry landing behind the German lines, virtually unopposed. The Germans immediately concentrated every available gun against this dangerous new bridgehead. Doug Vidler was a mortarman with the Canadian Highland Brigade.
It was a bad night. We'd been up all night. We didn't get to bed till 8 o'clock or something in the morning, but around 11 o'clock, a shell hit the top of our barn, and the shrapnel and dust and everything all came down. And Bob was laying beside me, and we were laying under a manger kind of thing. The word went out, anybody hit? And Blackie said he was hit. He got hit in the knee. So with that, I shook Bob and said, Bob, Blackie's hit. And with that, Bob rolled over. He had one little piece of shrapnel on his head. Just one little piece, hardly bled at all. And he was gone.
For 3 days, Doug Wittler and his comrades held on to their fragile bridgehead. Finally, tank destroyers and infantry of 4th Canadian Armoured Division broke through to relieve them. The German position in the Breskens Pocket was now hopeless. But the German commander ordered his men to fight on, even though many frontline units had lost 2/3 of their men, and most of the survivors were ready to give up. Canadian 3rd Division began a relentless, methodical advance across the pocket, smashing any point of German resistance with concentrated artillery fire and airstrikes. Scheldt Estuary, a D-Day veteran, entered what he took to be a recently liberated Dutch village.
Everything was deathly silence as I got into the town. Not a soul, not a sound. And just behind me, out of the windmill, came the Burgermeister with about 20 of his town people. And so I went over to them. They hugged me and kissed me, and I said, "Did you not get all this hugging and kissing out of your system when the infantry came through yesterday?" "Oh, you're the first one. The infantry were repulsed by the Germans. They're back a mile or so. You're the first one."
On the 3rd of November, the pocket finally fell, with the surrender of the German divisional commander and the rest of his troops. The Canadians were slowly tightening their grip on the estuary, though at a heavy price. Now it was time to launch their final assault on Walcheren Island and the coastal guns that dominated the Scheldt. For both sides, autumn on the Dutch coast promised to be wet and freezing cold.
There wasn't a guy whose main objective was to find a warm, dry place where he could have a good sleep. Never mind the German. Where can we find a warm, dry place to have a good sleep? We were all half conscious.
It was cold. There was ice forming on the edge of the canal. The green grass had covered in white frost.
Soldiers fought a daily battle to get warm, stay dry, and find hot food.
The Scheldt was freezing cold. The Canadians find themselves having to fight in greatcoats, in the thick woolen greatcoats. They're wearing balaclavas. They have leather jerkins on, anything to keep warm and to try and keep the water out. The Canadian and British rations weren't very imaginative. In fact, nowhere near as exciting as the menus that the American Army often had. Amongst the things that they got in their 24-hour ration packs were 10 of these biscuits, which was basically a bread substitute, and these could be broken up and used for making breadcrumbs and other things. There would be meat extract, blocks of meat, oatmeal blocks, there were 2 bars of chocolate, boiled sweets, chewing gum, salt, so all sorts of things to make very, very simple food. And you would cook these on a little hexamen stove, which you carried in your pack, which opened out like this. You'd have a hexamen block, which is the fuel, which would sit in the space underneath. And once you'd lit it, you could then put your food into the mess tin, put it on top of the stove, and cook it off. Another innovation at the time was self-heating tins of food, like this tin of mock turtle soup. And the idea here was that you would take your army jackknife, you would punch 2 holes in the side of the lid, lever off the cap, and then light the fuse inside, leave it for 5 minutes, and when you cut it open, it would be steaming hot soup ready to eat.
Added to the general discomfort of Canadian troops was a growing crisis of combat fatigue. The Canadian 2nd and 3rd Infantry Divisions had been in almost constant combat since Normandy, and because of a Canadian law governing overseas service, they weren't getting enough replacements from home.
The Canadian Army was starting to experience substantial manpower issues late in 1944. In addition to the casualties they had experienced during the earlier fighting, the Canadian Army in Europe was built out of people who had actually volunteered to leave Canada and fight in Europe. Not everybody did that, and that meant that the Canadians were facing a shortage of people who were willing to fight in Western Europe. In addition to the shortage itself, the Canadian troops who were actually in Europe were beginning to get a little worn down, and there was no relief in sight. More and more Canadian soldiers began to break down under the strain, whether physically wounded, physically ill, or battlefield exhaustion.
In the First World War, they called the guy shell shock. We called it battle fatigue. Guys got battle fatigue a couple of weeks after we got into action. And they were no good anymore, most of them. They sent them back to what we called anyway, a sleep camp. And they'd give a guy a needle and put him to sleep for a day or 2 days and give him a chance to rest up. Keep him there for 3 or 4 days and send him back up. Well, the theory was 2 trips to the sleep camp and you went into a labor battalion. But we were so short of men, we had no labor battalions that I ever heard of, so they kept sending them back. And, you know, it was a damn disgrace. Some of the guys deserted. I had a guy who was a very close friend of mine and a tip-top soldier. But once the mortar shells started coming in, he'd get up and start running around in circles. And I'd have to jump on him and put him down and sometimes punch him out to keep him quiet.
Despite the growing crisis of manpower, 2nd Canadian Infantry were now given another vital role to play in the 3rd phase of the Battle of the Scheldt. General Simmons wanted them to attack west along the narrow peninsula as part of Operation Vitality, ahead of the final assault on the coastal batteries of Walcheren Island. So the weary Canadians prepared for another attack across the broken dikes and flooded fields. They would be facing soldiers of the German 6th Parachute Regiment. Many were as exhausted, physically and psychologically, as the Canadians. But even though the struggle to hold the Scheldt looked increasingly doomed, the Germans continued to fight doggedly. They had at least been safe from Allied air attacks for the last few weeks, thanks to heavy cloud and bad weather. But whenever the skies cleared, Hawker Typhoons and Supermarine Spitfires, armed with rockets and cannon, swarmed in to strafe German positions. John Thompson was the Canadian pilot of a rocket-firing Typhoon.
Anybody on the ground, it sounded like an express train coming, particularly a salvo. And the Germans, they were very leery about when they got attacked by typhoons. They didn't like the noise. That several of the German prisoners would say, well, yeah, the noise of those rockets is pretty terrifying.
In late October, the Allies used radio intercepts to pinpoint General von Sangen's headquarters and sent 4 squadrons of Typhoons to wipe it out. The attack killed 74 German officers and left 15th Army headquarters in chaos for days. The Canadians hoped to take advantage with a fresh attack along the peninsula. They had learned the lesson of Black Friday. This time, German defenses were blasted by a massive artillery barrage before the infantry went in under cover of darkness.
We moved in there about 2 o'clock in the morning and laid in the ditch on one side of the road until about 6 when we were told to charge. The charge was across about 1,000 yards of beet fields, flat as a pancake, nothing there but beets, and to take a dike on the far side being held by the German. We hardly got across the road when we had to retreat back into the ditch because of the machine gun, and the fire was so heavy you couldn't move. Somehow or other, we worked our way across that beet field to the dike at the end. There was very few of us left when we got there. We couldn't do much, but we spent the rest of the day throwing grenades back and forth, the Germans on one side and us on the other side, and they were just murder. The wounded were laying out in the field, hollering and yelling.
The Canadian infantry struggled forward, and by the end of the first day, they'd breached the first line of German defenses and taken 120 prisoners. But the next obstacle was even more formidable: the South Beveland Canal.
The German defense in the South Beveland sector is centered around this particular canal. The canal is a big obstacle to the Allied forces, and it's very difficult for them to cross this under fire. And the Germans therefore include this as an integral part into their defensive plan.
Rather than tackle the canal head-on, General Simmons ordered an outflanking attack by the 52nd Lowland Division, using buffaloes to land at Hoedenkenskerke. At a stroke, this bold amphibious operation bypassed the canal and made it worthless as a defensive position. The German troops hurriedly pulled back to Walcheren Island itself, where they would make their last stand, protected by concrete fortifications and coastal batteries. 4 weeks into the battle for the Scheldt, the Allies were closing in on their goal, the naval guns of Walcheren Island.
Blocking the end of the Scheldt Estuary was the island of Walcheren. Walcheren was heavily defended by the Germans. It was basically very flat and low-lying and surrounded by a dike, and the Germans had built concrete pillboxes and guns emplaced around the top of that dike.
Until Walcheren Island was taken and its heavy guns neutralized, no Allied ships could sail up the Scheldt to Antwerp, and the advance on Germany remained stalled through lack of supplies. By now, General Dasser, commanding what Hitler optimistically termed Scheldt Fortress North, could call only on the remnants of 70th Infantry Division, the 89th Fortress Regiment, and 2 battalions of naval gunners. Their orders from the Führer remained clear: fight to the last man. Meanwhile, Canadian Commander Guy Simmons was devising another bold amphibious operation for the final assault on Walcheren Island. First, the RAF would bomb Westkapelle, destroying the island's outer dike and allowing the sea to rush in and flood the interior. Then he would launch 2 amphibious assaults by Scottish Infantry and Royal Marine Commandos, landing at Vlissingen and Westkapelle, while 2nd Canadian Infantry attacked from the east across the narrow channel separating Walcheren from the mainland.
Montgomery built up a massive assault force to take the Walcheren fortress. Lots of landing crafts, lots of Buffalo amphibious vehicles, and thousands of men, and the plan was essentially a replica of what had happened at Normandy on June 6, 1944. A massive initial bombardment followed by waves of landing craft and amphibious vehicles taking the soldiers ashore to capture the fortress and finally open up Antwerp to Allied supply ships.
The Canadians began their attack on the 31st of October, but reaching the channel, they soon found it was too deep to cross on foot and too muddy for assault boats. The only option was to advance up the Walcheren Causeway, a single narrow road a mile long, connecting the island to the mainland. Company after company was sent up the causeway, only to get pinned down by heavy German fire.
So they lined the guys up in rows and send them across this damn thing, and you couldn't move. The Jerry's were sitting at the far end, machine gun fire. They had old French 75mm cannons shooting them like machine guns down the middle. And they kept sending more and more guys, and we were given covering fire. I smoked a can of 100 cigarettes in about 3 hours, believe it or not. Just lighting one off the other. We were just changing barrels on the Bren gun. Between their guys and ours, they finally got half a dozen guys or so to the far end. But that was it.
With the Canadians pinned down on the causeway, the success of the attack would depend on Simmons' amphibious landings. The RAF bombing raid had been a success, blowing giant gaps in the dikes and flooding the island. The way was clear for Allied amphibious vehicles to strike at the heart of the German defensive positions.
When the attack went in, amphibious vehicles like this Buffalo could go through those gaps and round the rear of the dikes and attack the German defences from behind. And the Buffaloes would be perfect for this because not only could they carry men ashore, they were armour-plated on the front on this LVT-4 model Buffalo, and they were given guns. So it's got a 20mm Polston cannon and Browning machine guns on it that would help put suppressing fire down on the German positions as they come ashore and release the infantry to finish the attack.
Royal Marine Jim Kelly was part of the Buffalo assault wave, but things didn't go quite to plan.
They were put into tank landing craft, and we got into the Buffaloes inside the tank landing craft, so that we were loaded into the Buffalo. But the Buffalo was an amphibious box. We came out the landing craft in this thing, and right away it was bogged down in the water. Never got any further. We had to get out and wade ashore. It's just the same old wet landing. A freezing cold day, 1st of November.
At Vlissingen, the island's main port, the Germans were caught off guard, and British troops landed almost unscathed. But resistance intensified as they moved inland. They were soon engaged in fierce street fighting that would last several days. Meanwhile, off Westkapelle, a covering force of landing craft took on the heavy German shore batteries with rockets and cannon.
They were taking on the batteries, but they were a bit of a one-sided fight. That was, and they lost quite a few. But at least they did the job. They took the fire away from us, so we were able to get in and get on top of the batteries.
Under the cover of this barrage, the Marines got ashore with only light casualties. On the beaches and dikes, they faced no more than sporadic resistance from the Germans. But occasional mortar shells and mines claimed a steady toll. German S-mines, known as bouncing Bettys, were lethal.
We actually go over the top, just come over the top of the dunes and then start trotting towards and take a chance on the mines. Well, what we used to do, really, on the minefields was up skates and at them. Because the faster you ran, if you stood on a mine, the better the chance you had of getting away with it. Because it took about 4 seconds to pop up out of the ground to about 6 foot high before it exploded in shrapnel balls. So if you ran fast enough, you could get away with it, which you did. It worked.
The fighting on Walcheren Island lasted 8 days. Then, on the 8th of November, the Germans began to surrender.
The next morning, they would come out with all their gear packed, the little haversacks and whatnot, and they'd come out and just surrender.
With the German coastal batteries neutralised, Royal Navy minesweepers went to work, making the Scheldt Estuary safe for Allied supply ships. On the 28th of November, the first Allied convoy sailed up the Scheldt to unload its precious supplies at Antwerp docks. The first ship to unload was from Canada. The opening of Antwerp was a serious blow to the Third Reich.
The significance of the Scheldt and Antwerp is really underlined by the enemy reaction. More V2 rockets were aimed at Antwerp than any other place during that part of the war. Antwerp was also highly significant in the terms of Hitler's final offensive in the war, the Ardennes offensive, because the objective there was to retake Antwerp, cut off the supplies, and undermine the whole of the Allied war effort on the Western Front.
The battle for the Scheldt was a hard-fought, 5-week campaign led by Canadian troops, who paid a heavy price for their success. Around 7,000 of the 12,000 Allied casualties were Canadians. The battle cost the Germans between 10 and 12,000 men and more than 40,000 prisoners. Victory transformed the situation for the Western Allies and ensured their forces would have the fuel and ammunition they needed for the final push into Germany. But it was a victory for which many Canadians believed, then and now, that their country never received proper recognition.
First ship up the Scheldt was a Canadian destroyer. And a lot of dignitaries from the different regiments. Somebody said, "Where are the Canadians?" Nobody invited us. Even though we did a lot in the Battle of the Scheldt Estuary.